What's the hardest family conversation you've never had?
I stood in the aisle with my program folded like a timid bird in my palm, pretending I was just another proud sister in a sea of proud sisters, while inside I was doing that quiet arithmetic the overlooked learn by heart, tallying every time my mother praised my sister's sparkle and every time she told me, so gently it almost sounded like kindness, that my talent was the kind that did not need a spotlight. And as the brass ensemble stumbled into a hopeful march and the ushers waved people toward the rows like air traffic controllers for fragile egos, she leaned toward my ear and gave me one last reminder, a soft command disguised as concern, that today was not about me and that I should not draw attention away from the star of the family. I smiled with the kind of smile you wear when you are trying not to chip a tooth on the old resentment lodged there, and I told her I understood, because of course I understood, since I had understood at every holiday dinner when my updates were nice, while my sisters were astonishing, and at every birthday when my cake had candles while her accomplishments had speeches, and at every ordinary Tuesday when my mother forwarded my sister's wins to the family group chat with a dozen exclamation points, and my own news was met with a thumbs-up afterthought from an uncle who still called me by my childhood nickname, which, by the way, I hate. The auditorium felt like an airport for people who had never missed a flight, perfumed and buzzing and earnest, with dads wrestling bouquets wrapped in crinkly cellophane, with moms adjusting collars and pointing their phones like courtroom stenographers desperate not to miss a syllable of greatness, with grandparents craning to see the stage as if they could squint hard enough to turn pride into permanence. And in the middle of this soft hurricane stood my sister in a dress the color of sugar glass, luminous and determined, and so certain of her place in the world that I almost envied the way certainty draped itself over her shoulders like a shawl. I told myself to breathe and to be gracious, and to follow my mother's instructions the way you follow a map through a neighborhood you used to live in but cannot wait to leave, because I knew the choreography by heart. Stand when the family section stands, clap when they clap, dab at my eyes when they dab at theirs, and do not, under any circumstance, correct anyone's version of the truth, even if their version ignores that last winter I worked the kind of hours that pin your shoulders to the chair and pull the light right out of your face, just to keep the rent paid and the car legal, while my sister, who is not a bad person, only a practiced beneficiary of benefit, sailed through a final semester on a kind wind of favors and admiration. I can tell you exactly when the memory that pushed everything off its shelf began to fossilize, because it happened in a coffee shop 2 blocks from campus, where the barista wore a cap embroidered with a cartoon pear and the espresso machine had a stutter, and my sister slid into the booth across from me with the unconcerned grace of someone who never enters a room thinking it might not want her, and she told me between sips that she was exhausted from polishing her thesis while managing her internship and recovering from a minor cold, and I nodded in the supportive rhythm that older sisters learn, and then she let slip one of those throwaway lines people toss when they trust the room too much, a mention of a shared drive and a template and a previous cohort and a professor who never checks the scaffolding, only the paint, and I felt the tiniest catch in my breath, the way you do when you hear something that should be harmless, but feels like a glass speed rolling toward the edge of a table. I did not become a detective, because that would be theatrical and, according to my mother, I am not theatrical. I became a careful rereader, a patient comparer. The sort of person who notices that certain metaphors recur like a family joke and that footnotes can be recycled like grocery bags, and I filed those notes in the long drawer behind my ribcage where I keep the things I am told to ignore. And I went on with my unremarkable life, which, from the outside, looks like a tidy apartment with a reliable coffee mug and a streaming queue that never judges me for falling asleep halfway through the same documentary. So when I took my seat with my mother on one side and my father on the other, and my mother repeated her warning as if it were a prayer that could save us from embarrassment, I nodded again, because nodding has always been the tax I pay to keep the peace, and I promised myself that I would be as small as the program folded in my hand, and that I would let the day belong to my sister the way my mother believes the sun belongs to the morning, and that nothing in my face would suggest that I knew. Anything other than the approved narrative, which is that hard work plus charm plus a dress that photographs beautifully leads you to the stage, and the handshake and the smile that says forever. Names were called, shoes scuffed, the brass found a cleaner note, and the dean, a man with kind eyes and a haircut that belonged to an earlier decade, stepped toward the podium with the measured patience of someone who understands that he is both interruption and permission. The gate between before and after, and my sister waited in the wings with her cohort, smoothing the glossy sash that matched her lipstick, while my mother whispered, one more time, that I must not make a scene, and I thought how funny it was that she imagined I had that kind of power, when for years I could not even get my own name spelled correctly on the holiday place cards. The dean tapped the microphone, offered a practiced smile that could steady a nervous room, and opened his notes, and the auditorium quieted in that peculiar way crowds do when anticipation turns into a single shared breath. And I felt the hairs rise on my forearms not because I expected trouble, at least not exactly, but because I recognized the tilt of a moment that is about to introduce itself with new rules. And he looked out over the families and the flowers and the banners that had been ironed for this exact afternoon, and he said, in a voice that was firm but not cruel, that before we congratulated anyone, before we cheered and filmed and lifted our favorite person onto the shoulders of collective approval, we should hear what was just discovered. And as the words walked calmly into the air and took their seats, the whole hall fell silent. Silence in a crowded room is never truly silent, because even when mouths close you can still hear the soft mechanics of hope grinding against fear, the rustle of programs like Nervous Birds, the wet adjustment of throats that suddenly remember how vulnerable they are, and into that delicate hush the dean released a sentence that floated like a slow balloon and then popped right over the center aisle, explaining in language that was measured and unmistakable that in the process of final audits, a concern had been raised about the originality of one capstone, that a preliminary review had found significant overlap with prior submissions archived by the department, and that while the faculty respected the intensity of the past semester, they respected academic integrity more, which, to be honest, is exactly the kind of grown-up announcement that should bore you and yet somehow made the air feel colder. As if the building had exhaled and decided to let the truth speak for itself. My mother's hand found my forearm with the accuracy of muscle memory, the same grip she used when crossing busy streets with two distracted daughters, except this time the pressure said, do not breathe wrong and do not be seen breathing at all. While my father attempted that stoic posture men rehearse in mirrors when they convince themselves they are not emotionally available, but they are, in fact, full to the brim, and down in the second row my sister stood with her cohort, chin high in the way. We were all taught to keep our chins, though the tightness around her mouth gave her away to anyone who has ever tried to smile with their stomach falling through a trapdoor. The dean, who I am convinced has survived 1,000 faculty meetings and therefore fears very little, continued with a fairness that would have impressed me on any other day, noting that the issue did not erase years of work or character, only forced the institution to pause, to verify, to prevent the degree from being a costume that fit anybody who borrowed it, and just when the collective brain began scanning the stage like a security camera, he added, very gently, that the student in question had been contacted, that a formal review was underway, and that, as of 1 hour earlier, additional corroborating material had been submitted anonymously to the Academic Integrity Office, which is where a small part of me, the part that does not pretend anymore, unclenched a fist it had been holding since winter and let blood run back into the knuckles. If you have never witnessed a high society whisper executed by middle-class families at an auditorium price point, let me tell you it is a full-body sport, with eyebrows sprinting to the hairline, with lips barely moving as entire theories get constructed, with phones slipping from purses to laps as group chats light up like indoor fireworks, and as the brass section lost its place and tried to pretend it had never found it, I watched the familiar choreography ripple outward. A girl with a rhinestone hair clip nudged her boyfriend. A grandmother in pearls frowned as if she had been personally inconvenienced by plagiarism. A man in a sport coat performed a miniature scowl that translated to our common tongue as well someone had to say it. And in the middle of this theater of manners, my mother lowered her voice to a dangerous kindness and told me that whatever was happening, I should not add fuel to it, which would have been insulting if it were not so heartbreakingly predictable. Here is the honest part one I'm not proud of, but I also will not deny, because we are too old to pretend that virtue alone keeps our heads above water. When the dean said submitted anonymously, a quiet instrument I had tuned over months started to play inside me, not a triumphant trumpet or a villain's drum, but a steady metronome that kept time with the choice I made after that coffee shop conversation in which my sister, without malice and with the confidence of someone who believes the world will never bill her for interest, described the scaffolding behind her paper, and I, in the weeks that followed, gathered publicly available submissions, cross-checked phrases that sounded suspiciously borrowed, and prepared a packet that any diligent reviewer could follow without breaking a sweat, then locked it behind a trigger that would move on its own at the right moment, because subtlety, when it works, is just loudness with good manners. I will admit I wanted the pause to land before the cheer, not because I craved spectacle for its own sake, but because I have sat through a lifetime of carefully staged applause that erased the small truths in the wings, and I wanted, just once, for the wings to walk out and take a measured bow of their own. So as the dean closed his folder and asked the audience to remain respectful while the program continued, my phone, face down on my knee like a polite accomplice, vibrated with the soft insistence of a reminder I had written in the plainest language possible, telling me that if the phrase additional corroborating material made it to a microphone, I should forward a second, even tidier bundle, not to the gossip mill and not to the press, but to the internship supervisor whose letterhead my sister had been waving around like a VIP wristband all spring. And because I am done pretending that passivity is a virtue, I slid my thumb across the screen and watched a message that had slept in drafts since April finally sprint into daylight. You might think that was excessive, that a single blow is enough when the point has been made, and on nicer days I might agree. Except nicer days do not usually involve my mother calling me dramatic for asking why one daughter's quiet wins must be wrapped in brown paper while the other's routine competence arrives by parade. And as the brass found a cautious chord and the ceremony limped forward with the kind of dignity I genuinely respect, my sister's phone lit up in her hand with a preview. She could not unsee a brief note from a supervisor who does not waste words, asking her to meet first thing Monday to discuss congruence between submitted work samples and archived materials, which is corporate, for we notice the same issue and we would like the truth while there is still a chair at this table. And although she did not look in my direction, a ripple passed through the row like the chill that follows a cloud across a summer yard. My mother, sensing movement without facts, leaned closer and whispered that families close ranks when outsiders attack and that I should remember that, and I said of course, because I have always remembered, even when the rank closed around me like a door on the wrong side of the lock, and I kept my face calm while a modest, bracing satisfaction spread through my chest the way a winter drink sets your stomach right, not because humiliation pleases me but because balance does, and while applause resumed in a thinner, uneven way, I traced the neat architecture of step one of a plan that had never required me to raise my voice, and I promised myself that I would not gloat, that I would not taunt, that I would let process, that famously boring hero, complete its work. For those who crave an immediate confession, a bright neon sign over my head spelling out I did this, I can only offer disappointment. Because the only confession I allow today is the one I already made to myself in that coffee shop when the espresso machine stuttered and my sister's confidence skipped like a scratched record, and I realized that my version of loyalty, after years of being drafted into other people's cover stories, would be honesty sharpened to a clean edge. So I sat there in that vast auditorium and let the machine of accountability turn its gears, and when the pause between names reached her row, the ovation that would have tumbled down like a scripted wave broke apart into puzzled claps and brave smiles. And I pressed my lips together to keep from adding anything foolish to the air, because revenge, when you do it right, does not require commentary, only timing and a refusal to keep carrying other people's mess. And as the dean cleared his throat and adjusted the Order of speakers like a man guiding a ship around an unexpected sandbar. My phone vibrated again with a red receipt that told me the second package had landed, and somewhere behind the stage curtain a door clicked, faint and final. While my sister inhaled sharply, my mother stiffened, and I stared straight ahead, already measuring the next quiet move. The house absorbed us like a mouth that had forgotten how to chew, because the moment we crossed the threshold and my mother flung her purse onto the hall table with that theatrical sigh she thinks reads as stoicism, the familiar furniture seemed to lean in as if it, too, expected me to apologize for whatever the world had decided to do to my sister, and before I had managed to slip off my shoes, my mother informed me in a voice sharpened by decades of practice that negative energy can show up in unexpected ways, and that today's disaster surely sprouted from the soil of my attitude, which would have been almost funny had it not been as predictable as weather in a desert, while my father, performing the role of stable bridge that sways just enough to suggest motion without ever threatening to collapse, murmured about misunderstandings and due process and how institutions sometimes get things wrong, and my sister, red-eyed but still impeccably composed in the way certain people learn. 2. Bia's children announced that the dean was overreacting and that her advisor would confirm everything was fine once context was considered, that tender word we all use when we want our intentions to erase our choices. I set my keys on the counter and listened to the domestic symphony that has been background music my whole life, the clatter of the good dishes my mother reserves for triumphs. The refrigerator door sucked open and slammed shut as if cold beverages could reframe reality, the tap running too long because people who have something to hide always scrub their hands as if guilt were a surface thing. And I tried to keep my face from broadcasting the part of me that wanted to be kind and the part of me that wanted to be fair, because those are not always the same, while my sister paced like a lawyer rehearsing a closing argument no jury would accept, listing the hours she had spent on her paper, the articles she had read, the outline she had refined, each point swinging like a lantern over a path that still led to the same dark door, and my mother demanded to know whether I had felt pleased on that stage when the dean made his little announcement, as she called it, her tone doing that dangerous thing where love straps itself to denial and insists on driving. My phone, which I had left face down on the dining table out of courtesy and also tactical discipline, nudged my attention with a single buzz that felt like a fingertip against the back of my neck. And I did not need to look to know it came from the person listed under an absurdly ordinary alias, someone who knows how to speak in sentences that travel without leaving footprints. A colleague of a colleague who had seen what I saw months ago and who had quietly agreed that truth is a better disinfectant than family gossip, and the message, short and almost affectionate in its restraint, said only that the first wave had reached the shore, that the office handling internships had acknowledged receipt, and that, should I wish to continue, the alumni board that funds merit stipends would benefit from receiving the same bundle, because awards that buy reputations are especially allergic to recycled prose, and while a kindergarten angel might have advised me to let the machine run on its current momentum, my guardian angel has a clipboard and a calendar and believes in follow-through. We ate in that strained way people do when they cannot taste anything and yet must perform normalcy, my father asking small, forgiving questions about parking at the ceremony and whether the brass section had always been this enthusiastic, my mother correcting my tone even when I had offered only silence, and my sister, who used to steal my sweaters and apologize with roses pilfered from the neighbor's yard, staring at the centerpiece with the bafflement of someone who cannot accept that gravity also applies to her, and I told myself, because I try to remain honest even when it does not flatter me, that a part of me wanted her to look up and say she knew, that she understood she had built a beautiful front porch on a house with borrowed walls, and that she needed help walking back to something sturdy. But each time I searched her face I found only outrage wrapped in self-preservation. And the generous voice in my head sat down and the practical voice took the chair. After dinner, which was more of a tactical retreat than a meal, I took my plate to the sink and stood with my hands in warm water long enough to watch into clarity a memory I had allowed to blur. The night 2 winters ago when my sister introduced me to her internship supervisor at a holiday mixer, and he shook my hand while glancing over my shoulder for someone brighter, then congratulated my sister on being a natural fit for excellence. A compliment so inexpensive it might as well have been printed on napkins, and I remember thinking in that moment that compliments require proof, but proof does not require compliments, which is a long way of saying I dried my hands, lifted my phone, and sent the stipend board a package assembled with patience and no malice. The subject line polite to the edge of bland, the body text clinical enough to be boring, because nothing terrifies a performative scandal more than a document that refuses to perform. Of course my mother saw the movement as mothers do, and she asked, without moving her lips, whether I was texting about this, and I said I was confirming a work schedule for Monday, which was not a lie, strictly speaking. Because on Monday I would be working at something I had needed years to learn, the kind of work that is quiet, meticulous, and resistant to the sentimental habit of letting charm outrun consequence, and my father, sensing the electric fence I had just erected with those words, changed the subject to the dog he hopes to adopt when he slows down, though he has never once in his life slowed down for anything except the speed bumps, and my sister disappeared down the hall to call a friend who always knows how to inflate a sinking mood, leaving behind her perfume like an alibi. A wiser person than me might have paused there, letting the night drape itself over the day like a heavy curtain and trusting that the weight of institutional process would press the wrinkles flat, but I am not wiser. I am simply done. And when I reached my car for the drive back to my apartment, where the plants do not take sides and the coffee table never asks why I cannot be nicer, I opened my email again and sent a third message to the Campus Honor Council, a brief note containing a question I had left bookmarked for months, asking whether the department's archive of past capstones included versions hosted on a shared drive that should have been disabled after graduation, because if such a drive existed and was still accessible, that would represent a systemic gap worth closing, and also, incidentally, would explain why certain metaphors had footprints in more than one paper, and I hit send with a steadiness that surprised me, then watched the taillights ahead blur into a red seam as I finally let the long breath go. By the time I reached my building, my phone had collected replies that were not admissions and were not condemnations either, the kind of measured acknowledgments written by people who fear defamation and litigation in equal measure. And seeing those courteous hedges lined up in my inbox gave me the smallest, most unglamorous sense of relief, not the fireworks of vindication my mother always expects in other people's movies, but the soft click of a door aligning with its frame. And I set the phone on the counter next to the bowl of limes that never become anything, promising myself I would sleep before doing anything else rash, and then the screen lit with a call from an unknown number that belonged, according to the voicemail that followed, to a member of the Dean's Committee who wished to verify the chain by which the anonymous packet had been sent and whether I could, off the record and strictly confidential, confirm a timeline that only a small number of people could know, and I stared at the pulsing icon, every instinct I owned paging the others, while a second call flashed from my sister, and somewhere down the hall a neighbor's television shouted about a breaking update. And I realized that the next decision would not be about what I had already done, but about what I was willing to admit, which is when the lights in my apartment flickered once, as if the building had changed its mind, and the message preview from the stipend board slid onto the screen with a single sentence that ended without a period, inviting me, by name, to discuss something that could not wait until morning. The voicemail blinking on my screen carried that careful diction institutions reserve for moments when truth threatens to swell beyond the walls of procedure, and while the voice repeated the words strictly confidential, with a politeness that felt like a glove over a firm hand, I understood that what they truly wanted was not my opinion or my outrage or even my satisfaction, but my chronology, the sober spine that would let them stand upright when the room tilted. So I returned the call with a tone that suggested I had all the time in the world and none to waste, and I listened to the committee member clear his throat twice before asking whether I could describe, without editorial, how the anonymous packet found its way into their intake system at such a precise hour, which is the kind of question you answer like a person describing a grocery list, because the more boring the facts sound, the more lethal they become when stacked. And while I paced my kitchen with my bare feet, mapping Familiar grout lines. I told him about calendar reminders labeled with names so ordinary they could have been shopping items, about metadata that had been washed clean of personality but not of sequence, about a coffee shop conversation that made me set a timer not for vengeance, but for verification, and when he thanked me with a sincerity that suggested relief, he asked if I had shared any of this with the student in question. A phrase that draped anonymity over a face we both knew, and I said that she and I had discussed ethics in the general sense families discuss religion at Thanksgiving, which is to say loudly and without progress, and he laughed once, softly, in the way people do when they are not supposed to agree with you but cannot help themselves. My sister's name flashed next, not once but twice, then again with the insistence of someone who has mistaken urgency for righteousness, and because I believe in facing music even when I did not compose the melody. I answered and let her pour out the performance I have watched her perfect since we were kids, and she learned that tears, when delivered on schedule, can reroute consequences, and she asked me whether I had interfered, whether I understood the magnitude of humiliation, whether I could live with myself knowing that a moment meant to celebrate our family had been turned into a spectacle, and I waited for the part where she expressed something like regret, a nod toward the possibility that shortcuts are not roads but trapdoors. Yet instead she told me that context would save her, and that the dean had always liked her work, and that this would blow over if certain people stopped feeding the fire, and I said her name the way you say a word that suddenly tastes foreign. Then told her I did not control fire, I respected it, and that if she wanted a different outcome she should have built with brick rather than cardboard, which is not the line she expected and certainly not the absolution my mother had ordered me to provide. And she hung up with a lovely, furious gasp that reminded me of the day she quit piano because the metronome made her feel judged. The stipend board, less theatrical and more surgical, invited me to a brief video call that began with 3 small faces arranged like a traffic light: caution, caution, stop, and the chairwoman, who could slice water with a glance, thanked me for the documentation, and then asked whether I had considered the collateral damage of withdrawing funds midstream. Speaking of internships and summer housing and reputational harm, as if they were weather patterns that simply happened rather than choices that accumulated into climates, and I replied that what we call collateral is often the bill arriving late, and that if their mandate was to reward excellence, then allowing pace to pass for marble undermined the temple they were so busy polishing. And although her expression never softened, I watched her eyes stop scanning for a softer landing and settle into the bracing geometry of consequence, and she concluded, with professional restraint, that a provisional suspension would take effect pending the integrity review, which in their language meant the stipend would freeze, the access badge would lock, the summer would tilt, and I, who am not cruel but am tired, thanked her for attending to reality rather than optics, then closed the laptop and leaned my forehead against the cabinet door long enough to watch my breath leave a pale oval that vanished when I laughed at myself for being dramatic in an empty kitchen. Revenge, the kind that does not wear sequins or post selfies, is mostly admin, a series of unglamorous confirmations that refuse to blink, so I opened the folder I had labeled with a childhood nickname I dislike and sifted through the last smallest pieces I had held back like a gambler saving 2 decent cards, among them a screenshot of a shared drive permission set that had remained open to all with link beyond the retirement date, a polite email from an adjunct who had begged for tighter locks and received only warm assurances, and a time-stamped capture of a paragraph that had migrated verbatim from a 3-year-old submission to my sister's draft with only the adjectives laundered. And I drafted a note to the department chair that was neither accusatory nor coy, framing it as a systems issue, because people clutch their pearls at accusations, but they roll up their sleeves for maintenance. And I attached the evidence with captions so mild they could have been weather reports. And I copied the university's counsel because if institutions love anything more than integrity, it is liability avoidance. And then, because my mother had trained me to think ahead even when she refused to think inward, I set a delayed send to the alumni newsletter editor with a neutral request for a correction policy on celebratory blurbs, in case a certain congratulatory piece needed to be updated for accuracy. which I knew would prompt a contingency plan that would, in turn, ripple back toward the dean's office like a tide following the moon. I would love to say I paused there out of mercy, that I poured a drink and let the house grow quiet and allowed the night to file its paperwork without my supervision, but a message from a former classmate, someone who once lost an award to my sister by the width of a ribbon, arrived with a link to a private forum where alumni exchanged notes about mentorship placements. And buried inside a kindly worded thread was an observation that certain students seemed to acquire glowing recommendations cut from the same cloth, with phrasing so consistent it could have been pasted, and, because patterns, once you see them, refuse to stop waving their arms. I composed one more careful email to the mentorship coordinator asking whether recommendation templates were provided centrally or whether, perhaps, a well-meaning staffer had shared a sample that had become scripture. And I thanked them in advance for clarifying, which is a phrase that opens doors because it flatters and corners at the same time. And with that final click, I stood very still, listening to the refrigerator hum like a cheap orchestra warming up for a performance that had not yet been announced. My mother's text landed at exactly that moment, a composition of elliptical kindnesses and implied accusations, asking whether I could stop escalating and think of the bigger picture. A phrase that always means the family portrait where the crack in the frame is cleverly cropped out, and I typed back that I was thinking of the biggest picture I knew, the kind where work equals work and trust equals trust. And she responded with a single line requesting that I come over in the morning to talk like adults, which made me smile because adults in our family have always been the ones who know where the silver is hidden but never who polished it, and while I set the phone face down again, the room settled into that hell-breath quiet that follows a storm. A deceptive calm I recognized from childhood when I would crawl under the piano during arguments and count the pedals to keep from interrupting, and just as my heartbeat learned a slower rhythm, an email from the dean's office arrived. With one paragraph and no ornament, inviting me to a confidential meeting at 9 the next morning to assist the committee in establishing provenance of materials, a sentence so precise it clicked like a key in a lock, while, in a separate window, a calendar alert I had forgotten I created months ago unfurled its reminder like a crisp flag, telling me that if Step 3 concluded, Step 4, whose title I will not yet share, should begin, which is how I knew the night was not done rearranging the furniture, and that the thing I had held back as both insurance and warning would need to be placed, carefully and without dramatics, where it could do the most honest, least forgiving good. Morning arrived with that brittle brightness that makes kitchens look cleaner than they are, and while the kettle grumbled itself toward usefulness I rehearsed, not the theater of righteous anger that would have satisfied a simpler appetite for spectacle, but the litany of dates and documents and deliberate pauses that had carried me from a coffee shop remark to a sequence of institutional acknowledgments. So when I walked into the dean's office at 9 and found the committee arranged with their pens aligned like runway lights and their faces set to the expression bureaucracies where when they sense a storm can still be shepherded into rain rather than hail, I sat where they indicated and gave them, in sentences stacked like scaffolding, the provenance they wanted: download logs scrubbed of vanity but rich with sequence, permission maps that read like blueprints of negligence, side-by-side passages whose resemblance did not require a specialist to detect, and the record of a timed submission that moved without me once the conditions were met, then listened as they thanked me with the kind of gratitude that never flowers into apology yet still feels like a hinge turning in the right direction, after which the general counsel, which is the role that speaks in commas and caveats rather than adjectives, asked whether I had considered the reputational aftershocks for the family, and I replied that the word reputation has always functioned in our house like a spare bedroom we were not allowed to enter, well-dusted and rarely occupied, while the rest of us tried to sleep on the couch. They outlined their process with clipped precision, explaining that a preliminary finding would be issued by Friday, that sanctions ranging from resubmission under supervision to formal revocation lived in the possible outcomes depending on the breadth of duplication across underlying sources, that the internship and stipend committees had been notified and would proceed according to their own charters, and then, because institutions, for all their signage and policies, are still run by people whose hands tremble when holding other people's futures. They asked whether I wanted to attach my name to the anonymous materials now that the engine was already running. And I told them that I had learned in my family the difference between credit and responsibility, that I would accept the second without contest and decline the first without regret, though I did ask, gently and on the record, that their report include a section on the shared drive vulnerability and the recommendation template. Practice that had silently trained a generation to copy tone along with content, since systems, when they are sloppy, make sinners out of people who might have chosen better if the floor had been more level. And the chair nodded in that slow way that says not only heard but adopted, which, for all my supposed taste for revenge, gave me a steadier pleasure than any headline would. By the time I left that room, the air had warmed into a day that could have been ordinary if not for the throb in my pocket where my mother's texts multiplied like impatient bees, each insisting that I come home to discuss how we would present a united front, a phrase that in our lexicon always meant that I would fold my feelings into a shape that fit the family china. Yet I drove there, because I have never been afraid of rooms that ask me to be smaller, and when I walked in, my sister at the table with a legal pad and my father folding and unfolding a dish towel in a choreography of helplessness, my mother did not waste time with pleasantries, announcing that the dean had called to say the matter would be handled internally, and that with the right tone and the right timing and perhaps a letter from the pastor about character and growth the noise would die down, after which we could all put this ugliness behind us, and only then did she notice the envelope I placed by her elbow, thin and unremarkable, containing the forwarded recommendation template with its cheerful subject line and her own note, sent months ago and now printed in the clean font of consequence, suggesting that my sister mirror the phrasing for safety, and that everyone does it. And as her eyes moved over the page and the color left her face in quiet stages, I explained, not unkindly, that the alumni newsletter maintains a correction policy for prematurely published congratulations, that the mentorship program has stopped distributing sample letters effective immediately, and that the Honor Council, in addition to its investigation, will review department practices with specific attention to access controls. Which means this story is not just about one student's shortcuts, but about the comfortable ladders so many of us have been told were stairs. What followed was not an explosion, but a collapse, a slow-motion buckling of stories that had carried more weight than their beams could bear, with my father finally setting the towel down and asking my sister, in a voice that might have saved us all years ago, whether she had borrowed in ways that required returning, with my sister biting the inside of her cheek so hard I tasted iron in my own mouth as she whispered that she had done what everyone did, and that only fools write from scratch, when a map already exists, and with my mother lifting her chin to insist that the world punishes confidence in women, and that men with power recycle language every day without censure. Which is an argument I might have entertained if the duplicated paragraphs had not included the parts where conclusions were earned rather than performed, and I said that we could keep discussing abstractions until we all starved, or we could make a trade, the truth spoken plainly to the committee before their Friday finding, in exchange for the envelope remaining in this kitchen and not in the newsletter's corrections queue, after which I stood up not to grandstand, but because my knees had locked from sitting too long in a posture of patience. In the quiet that followed, a quiet stitched together from fear and recognition and the faintest thread of relief, my sister asked what would happen to her if she told the truth, and I told her that consequences do not disappear when ignored, they ferment. That she could still graduate in time if she chose the hardest path now, that a supervised rewrite, though humiliating in the way unvarnished work always is, can build a spine stronger than applause ever does, and that the internship world, despite its taste for bright surfaces, respects people who repair what they damage, after which she stared at the legal pad as if a blank page could vote, and my mother, who loves us in the way that makes daughters into mirrors, not people, asked whether I would still go public if we handled it as a family, and I told her that families are not sovereign nations exempt from physics, that gravity still works in kitchens, that I would keep the envelope where it was if the truth left this house. and entered the record by the end of the day, which is when my phone chimed with an email from the chair summarizing our morning and attaching a draft of the system's fix I had requested, crediting me in a footnote that used my full name and a phrase I have never seen next to it, Citizen Auditor. And my mother inhaled sharply because attention, it seems, has a sound. I will not tell you which door my sister chose in that hour because even now the choice keeps moving when I try to pin it, fluttering between regret and resolve like a bird deciding whether the window is a promise or a lie. And maybe that is the point we miss when we turn stories into verdicts, since what I wanted was never to wear her as a trophy or to crush her with a lesson, but to stop carrying the weight of a family myth that required one daughter to shine only if the other stood in shadow. So I left the envelope on the table and walked out into a day that looked almost ordinary, with a message in my drafts that would send itself at dusk only if the chair's office did not receive a confession timestamped before sunset, with a scheduled post queued for my own professional page that did not mention her at all, but thanked the university for adopting a security fix proposed by an alumna advocate, and with the clean, private knowledge that revenge, when it has any decency, is not the art of destruction, but the insistence that the floor be level before anyone is allowed to dance, while behind me the house breathed like a field after lightning, not yet burning, not yet safe, and my phone, resting face down in my pocket, was quiet long enough for me to hear something better than victory, which was the sound of the story refusing to end neatly, the sound of doors remaining both open and closed until the people inside decide whether to walk through them.